the Enlightenment is embodied in the porcelain produced during the Age of Enlightenment. Across Europe during the 18th century, there was an active market for buying porcelain that was both functional as well as being decorative and ornamental. They were in daily use in aristocratic and well-to-do households. These consumers were inspired by a natural yearning to question and to learn from the scientific breakthroughs in knowledge of the age. Exploration, travel, and science were essentially funded by the ruling classes and encouraged new styles that were to capture the imagination of artists, sculptors, and modelers, as well as their patrons. This led to a transformation of the theatrical Baroque into a new and natural Rococo style that embraced man's relationship to the natural world. Europe in the mid-18th century was riveted by an insatiable appetite for knowledge, exploration, and discovery. This forged a new scientific approach which was to spearhead the age of the Enlightenment. Through new publications, science and nature became the pinnacle of taste and fashion among the aristocracy, who decorated their homes with this organic, natural force of life. Nature and the birth of English porcelain in London in the mid-1740s, developed by Nicholas Fremont and Charles Guan at the Chelsea Manufactory, provided an unparalleled opportunity for enlightenment and the arts to fuse together. The examples here illustrate the new natural Rococo style developed at Chelsea and at Worcester that patiently recreated animals and birds that were modelled or drawn from the life. These natural recreations filled the 18th century home with a totally reinvented cabinet of nature's curiosity. The ornithological forms manufactured at Chelsea between the years 1749 to 55 introduced a natural energy that was to grow throughout the repertoire of design, reaching its zenith, as we can see, from the contemporary catalogue of items manufactured at the Chelsea Porcelain Manufactory in the spring of 1755, when the previous year's production was sold. The village of Chelsea was situated outside the City of London on the banks of the River Thames. Thus the soil was extremely fertile, being rich with alluvial deposits. In the mid-18th century, this area was a network of nurseries for trees, which were depositories for seedlings brought back from foreign scientific exploration. There were also market gardens for the production of every kind of vegetable and fruit needed for the hungry within the environs of London. Sir Hans Sloane, the great naturalist, lived at Cheyne Manor and leased the area of the Physic Garden to the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries in perpetuity. He was the catalyst that brought together the naturalists and the large group of birdmen that lived in London and its village environs at the time. The man responsible for this translation of interest in ornithology into Chelsea porcelain models was George Edwards, here on the right. Known as the father of ornithology, Edwards is immortalised in the Chelsea models that are directly copied in every detail from his publication, A Natural History of Uncommon Birds, and of some other rare and undescribed animals. The first volume was published in 1743, the second in 1747, the third in 1750, and the fourth volume in 1751, published and printed by the Royal College of Physicians, where Edwards had been appointed librarian on the recommendation of Sir Hans Sloane in 1733. Edwards visited Sir Hans Sloane on a weekly basis, and it is clear that the relationship was one of pupil and mentor. Sir Hans Sloane had, during and after his travels, collected an astonishing array of natural specimens, the dried and preserved examples we now see in the Enlightenment galleries of the British Museum and the Natural History Museum. He had also collected a good many live specimens of birds and animals, which he kept in his menagerie at Cheyne Manor. It was here that Edwards recorded and sketched many of the examples that we see in the 4 volumes that make up the Natural History of Uncommon Birds, which in part he dedicated to Sir Hans Sloane and in part to God. The volumes clearly provided his neighbour Nicholas Fremont, and his gifted modellers with a raft of different and new natural models to recreate in porcelain, a series of birds that had grasped the interest of the ruling classes, now translated into the new and novel material of porcelain. These porcelain examples are modelled to an astonishingly high degree of natural accuracy, and show, of course, that Chelsea had access to these volumes. They provided a natural source of examples recently recorded and modelled from life that perfectly captured the imagination of the scientifically minded aristocracy and their quest for enlightened knowledge. The models are slip-cast on the whole and luted onto supporting bases that is naturally appropriate for the model that it supports. Most of the models are marked with a raised anchor, usually enamelled in red, on an oval pad applied to the side of the base. This mark was in use between 1749 and 1752. The models are nearly all given the colouring as shown in the printed volumes. Some are left in the white, but on these rare examples there sometimes can be found some traces of cold colour, suggesting that these too were once vividly coloured. From a detailed examination of the text placed on the opposite page to that of the illustrated bird, it is clear that Edwards was at the centre of the large group of ornithologists that lived in London. Many of this group are named here, together with where they lived and how they had procured the bird in question, along with other details that Edwards considered sufficiently important. Joseph Dandridge, the artist who painted George Edwards, is one of these birdmen, and it is easy to imagine that the visits when painting his portrait were combined with observing Dandridge's birds, butterflies, and collection of nature's curiosities. Now, turning to the volumes themselves, for it is there that we see and understand this extraordinary Enlightenment publication and its remarkable influence on 18th century English porcelain manufacture. Volume 1, 1743, Plate 6, the smallest green and red Indian parakeet. The first bird which we can easily compare to Chelsea porcelain is the smallest green and red Indian parakeet. Birds tended to be represented if small enough, life-size, and this is the case with this bird, which was brought from Holland, pickled in spirits by Dr. Cromwell Mortimer, who was secretary to the Royal Society. Edwards claims that it was originally sourced from a Dutch settlement in the East Indies. Mortimer allowed him to borrow the specimen to observe and draw it, and the colours literally came to life, as Edwards puts it, as depicted here when the bird was taken out of the camphorated spirits, washed and dried. The Chelsea porcelain example completes the comparison, the raised anchor mark 1749 to 52. Having studied many rare examples of Chelsea birds of the raised anchor period, and this example being painted exactly as Edwards describes, I would consider this to belong to the early part of the date range. I also include a very rare Worcester porcelain punch bowl, decorated in the London atelier of James Giles and dating from 1765, from an English private collection. This shows two parrots, one being the Indian parakeet. Notice also how the vegetation, moss and leaves, together with the bark of the tree branches, compares directly with the original Edwards engraving. Plate 7 is the Chiraco, about the size of a jay, as Edwards tells us, and he observed it living at Colonel Lowther's house in St. James's Park. What genus of birds to range this with, I cannot positively say. It climbs not as parrots do. Edward was able to make detailed drawings of this bird in many poses for, as he quotes again, several persons of distinction. The Chelsea porcelain bird is copied extremely faithfully in pose and size from the illustrated plate, where even the tree support is taken from Edward's engraving. The coloured example is from the Schreiber bequest, decorated in an independent workshop traditionally considered to be that of William Dewsbury, has, like many examples, a curious way in which the mosses are enamelled. Puce with a washover of green. This again clearly derives from the depictions of vegetation from Edward's plate. And for comparison, I've also included a dessert plate from the H.R. Marshall collection in the Ashmolean Museum, Oxford. This is Worcester porcelain, decorated in the Giles atelier. Only 6 of these bird plates are recorded. The scallop borders show radiating stylized grasses. These plates are perhaps direct commissions from the Giles atelier for the person of distinction, as Edwards writes in his text of this bird. Plate 10, the swallow-tailed kingfisher. Edward tells us that this bird is depicted in its natural size, which is nearly the size of an English kingfisher. The bird is taken from a stuffed example from the collection of the Duke of Richmond at Goodwood, where Edwards describes seeing it, and I quote, enclosed and pasted up in glass so that I could not handle it. Edwards describes that this bird has been found in Suriname in South America and brought via Holland to England. This particular bird appears on 2 pieces of Worcester porcelain decorated in the London atelier of James Giles. The first from a pair of plates, as I previously mentioned, from other surviving examples from a dessert service, formerly in the Rouse Lench collection, and now in the collection of the late Harry Hyams. They possess and show the natural stringy branches that we know so well from this type of naturalistic bird painting on Worcester porcelain of 1765. Clearly, it is taken directly from the Edwards engraving. There is also a single Worcester porcelain tea bowl depicting the same bird, decorated in the Giles atelier. We show here Sir Hans Sloane from the portrait by John Vanderbank, which is from the British Museum's collection. Plate 12, the Arabian bustard. To my mind, the most interesting of all birds given to us by Edwards, an extremely rare natural example, and I quote, about the bigness of a turkey. It is longer legged and necked and slender bodied than the common bustard. And here follows one of the most intimate descriptions that we see within his volumes, and it is clear that he observed it in some great detail. The surprising thing is that the bird belonged to none other than Sir Hans Sloane himself, and was living at Cheney Manor. Edwards tells us, this bird was kept alive for many years by my honoured patron, Sir Hans Sloane, Baronet, at his house in London, where goodness gave me free leave to draw any curious thing that he had in his possession. This bird was brought from Mocha in Arabia, Felix, and presented to Sir Hans Sloane by Charles Dubois, Esquire, Treasurer to the India Company. There is but one example rendered in Chelsea porcelain, making this noble bird model the rarest to be found. It was owned by the late Harry Hyams and forms part of his great porcelain collection. The model with raised anchor mark is left white and not enamelled. Of course, one could argue that the slightly leaning position the model has shows that it might not have been the easiest model to fire, but nevertheless, none other is recorded. Plate 13, the guan or guan, so called in the West Indies. Edward tells us that this bird is a little bigger than a common hen. It pretty nearly resembles a turkey. He states also that I saw one of these birds at Captain Chandler's in Stepney, who brought it with him from one of the sugar islands in the West Indies. He also states that another name by which the species of bird is known is the Jacupima of Margrave. The Chelsea example shown here from the Schreiber bequest of the Victoria and Albert Museum, marked with a raised anchor picked out in red enamel. It is coloured naturalistically like the illustrated engraving, but with a more purple hue, though the head is closely comparable to the exact colours of the original engraving. This white example has been transferred to the Victoria and Albert Museum from the Museum of Practical Geology, formerly on Jermyn Street. Cold colour can be seen in the eye and on the tail of this example. from which one can infer the possible practice of a passionate amateur bird collector being able to colour up the exact ornithological plumage colours. There you can see the coal colour remains on the tail and on the eye there. Plate 18, the solitary sparrow. And I quote, "Famed for their sweetness in singing, Edwards includes this bird as an example of the curious, and we are told that it, and I quote again, it resembles a blackbird." Edward goes on to say, "I drew and described this from the live bird at Sir Charles Wager's, curiously in the very garden where George Dionysius Eret had visited to see the flowering magnolia that he painted on successive days. The birds," and I quote, "are said to be found in the mountainous parts of Italy and breed in rocks and old ruined towers." The Chelsea examples here from the Judge Owen Untermeyer bequest in the Metropolitan Museum in New York are coloured precisely as the original engravings suggest, with an all-over blue to their bellied plumage, though it can be noticed that instead of the fruiting red hawthorn shown in the Edwards engraving here, indicative of its food source or place of natural habitat, sprigs of the Cretan oak have now been used. Plate 21, the blue creeper and the golden-headed black titmouse. Edward states that his depictions are precisely the natural size of each of the birds, and he tells us that these two curious birds were lent to me by His Grace the Duke of Richmond. They are neatly set up with many others in glass cases, and that they were sent to the Duke via Holland from Suriname, a Dutch settlement on the continent of South America. It is generally quite clear which birds have been drawn by Edwards from the life, as a sense of natural vigour can be tangibly felt through his drawings. Equally, as in this case, one can tell if the birds are stuffed and placed within a tableau glass case, as there is something quite stilted in their imagined pose. The Chelsea Porcelain translation of the original engraving is certainly an ambitious conception, featuring the two birds in this surmised pose. The example here shown, with the raised anchor mark picked out in red enamel, is from the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, from the gift of Richard Payne, and formerly from the Hutton collection. It is coloured exactly as Edwards illustrates. Plate 24, the blue redbreast. Edwards delights us with a scientific, enlightened description. This bird seems to be of that tribe or family of slender-billed birds who feed on insects. He adds a small fly to the plate, as you can see here, which has caused him to depict the bird about to eat it. This also makes the bird to appear to be in song, perched as it is on a series of 3 stumps. I had this bird from Mr. Peter Collinson, the naturalist and avid gardener, and the middleman of an international exchange of scientific ideas in the mid-18th century London. He is best known for his horticultural friendship with John Bartram, the Pennsylvanian farmer and botanist, and also his correspondence with Benjamin Franklin about electricity. Edwards mentions that Mr. Catesby had already called this bird Rebecula americana, who I think told me it came from the Bermudas, which is a proper name enough, since this bird and mine are certainly of that genus of which the robin redbreast is a species. This bird does not appear in Chelsea porcelain like so many of Edwards's uncommon birds, but it is found in the early products of the Bow Manufactory and dates to 1750 to 52, and therefore contemporary with the Chelsea examples. They are beautifully and very delicately modelled to be one of the very finest hands at work at that manufactory. They are usually called fledglings, but when compared to Edward's plate, with open mouths standing on gnarled stumps with exposed roots, it is clear that they derive from this particular source. Plate 28, the blue-throated redstart. We are told in Edwards's own words that this bird is bigger than the common redstart. It's of the size here expressed. For shape, like other small birds of this kind, I have seen a drawing of it from Holland or Germany, which was named Blauwkerl, which is blue throat, or it being so near of kin to the redstart, I have given it the above name. Edwards then goes on to tell us that the bird was sent to him by naturalist Mark Catesby, whose sponsor or patron was Peter Collinson, and that the bird had been sent to Catesby from Gibraltar. I presume in this case that Edwards was sent this bird in a dried state. Although this bird is not depicted in a three-dimensional way translated into porcelain sculpture, it does exist and is found among the 6 Worcester plates of the Ornithological Bird Service that I previously mentioned, and decorated in the London atelier of James Giles, evidently from a service taken from source prints from Edwards' Natural History of Uncommon Birds. This was formerly in the Rouse Lench collection, and again is from the collection of the late Harry Hymes. Plate 34 is the long-tailed, black-capped hummingbird. This intriguing and highly exotic bird was observed by Edwards from a live specimen, and he notes that this bird is engraved of its natural bigness, feathers being of a loose, soft texture, easily ruffled and flowing with the least breath of air. In this simple way, we can imagine Edwards blowing on the bird and observing the close reactions. The bird was owned by the naturalist Peter Collinson, at whose home Edwards was able to observe and sketch it. Edwards notes that there was also a stuffed example in the repository of the Royal Society, which had come when alive from Collinson's bird with Collinson's bird from Jamaica. Although not modelled in Chelsea porcelain, Collinson's bird appears on a Worcester saucer dish decorated in the London atelier of James Giles, dates from about 1765. It is in the H.R. Marshall collection at the Ashmolean Museum. Interesting, the swallowtail butterfly depicted in the Edwards engraved plate here was given by Edwards by Dr. R. M. Massey, who had procured it from Maryland, America. Plate 37, the crested hummingbird. One of the smallest of the birds illustrated and described by Edwards, and he tells us the bird with its nest is representative of its natural bigness. The bill is slender and sharp-pointed. Edwards shows the brightly coloured bird in the sweet sop tree together with its tiny nest. A Mr. John Warner was the person who showed this dried and stuffed specimen to Edwards, together with its nest, and Edwards tells us he had it of a captain who brought it from the West Indies. The crested hummingbird is seen here as part of the rare set of naturalistic bird plates manufactured at Worcester and decorated in the London atelier of James Giles. This plate is within the Harris Masterson collection of Worcester porcelain at Rienzi, the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, Texas. Plate 39, the red bird from Suriname. Edward tells us that the bird should be compared with, and indeed in his opinion is part of the same family as that of the gold-headed titmouse, and I quote, the feet in both agreeing with that of the kingfishers. The top of the head, lower part of the belly, thighs, rump, tail, and its covert feathers are of a beautiful red or scarlet colour, as can be seen on this plate. The bird was stuffed and in the Duke of Richmond's collection, but Edwards tells us, at first sight, it seems not unlike the cardinal-crested red grosbeak or the Virginian nightingale. I have found this bird only depicted once in porcelain on a rare Worcester saucer decorated in the London atelier of James Giles. This saucer appears to provide the proof that the surface was again taken from Edwards's birds, or even live birds within a private aviary of a significant birdman, for the feathers on the crest are raised, and Edwards goes on to tell us, this wants a crest, though I believe it can raise the feathers on the crown, they being pretty long and loose, that hath a manifest crest, which appears hanging backwards when not erected. Either these words have resonated with the enameller, or the enameller has been furnished with working sketches of the live bird, though there has clearly been an understanding. Plate 45, the greater Indian crane. We are told by Edwards, this is a very large and stately bird, I believe bigger than the common crane, hath a longer bill in proportion, and it walks in a grave and solemn air. Its height as it walks without extending the neck greatly is about 5 feet. Rather wonderfully, it is clear that Edwards drew this bird in 1739, whilst collecting specimens for his proposed natural history volumes. He tells us that, this bird I drew from the life at Sir Charles Wager's, who afterwards presented it to Dr. Mead. It was brought from the East Indies. Happily and amazingly, this source illustration provided a very testing but undoubtedly successful model for the Chelsea modellers to sculpt and translate into porcelain. The coloured example, which I'm about to show you, with a raised anchor mark picked out in red enamel, is from the Untermeyer bequest in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And there is a white example from the Schreiber bequest, which we might hazard a guess was painted at one time in correct ornithological colours. There is the example in the Schreiber bequest of the Victoria and Albert Museum. And here, against the plate 45 from volume 1, is the example, the coloured example from the Untermeyer bequest at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. We move on to volume 2. Printed for the author at the College of Physicians in Warwick Lane in 1747, Edwards makes a touching dedication to his mentor and patron, Sir Hans Sloane. Honoured Sir, suffer me to cast this weak essay towards natural knowledge into your boundless treasury of nature, that it may be supported by your charitable protection and screened under your illustrious name from the malice of detractors. If there be anything in it that is worthy of your notice, it is principally owing to your generosity in giving me all encouragement in the art of designing after nature, in which employment you have, without sparing your purse, continued me for many years, to my great improvement in that art. Yet, sir, your indulgent kindness in giving me a full liberty at all times for these many years past to consult and examine that inestimable treasure of nature and arts collected by the worthy industry and labour of a great part of your life, engages my gratitude more than any mercenary considerations. Edwards then thanks Sir Hans Sloane for influencing the Royal College of Physicians in their decision to employ him there as librarian there in 1733. He offers then prayers on behalf of his patron for a healthy and long life. On this page is an elaborate engraving, showing himself, Edwards here, in Roman garb of toga, seated in front of an easel, being shown how to draw by the classical muse Calliope, who presides over eloquence and epic poetry, so called from the ecstatic harmony of her voice. The easel is held up or supported on the wings of old Father Time, and surrounding the group within this Arcadian scene are the birds taken from his own volumes, resplendent in their exotic plumage, and inhabiting the Kentian frame surround. So volume 2, plate 54, the crested red or russet butcher bird. Edwards, who drew this bird in 1742, tells us that this bird is depicted of its natural bigness, it being the size and the shape and something of the colour of the hen butcher bird described by Willoughby. Francis Willoughby, an ornithologist, produced an influential work on birds and fish, which was published after his death by the naturalist John Ray. Willoughby's daughter Cassandra married the Duke of Chandos, who was one of the richest men in England at the time, and importantly for this lecture, a patron of the ornithologist Mark Catesby. Thus there is a line of connection from Willoughby to Edwards, via the latter's friendship with Catesby. Edwards tells us that the bird was sent from Bengal to his great friend Joseph Dandridge in Moorfields. Dandridge, of course, the artist who drew, painted, and engraved the portraits of Edwards, Dandridge was of Huguenot descent and a natural history illustrator, an amateur naturalist specializing in entomology, and a leading figure in the Society of Aurelians, which he was the founder member. He was clearly an extremely good friend of Edwards and other contemporary naturalists like James Pettifer, the entomologist, who lived very close to him. The Chelsea model with raised anchor mark is the example from the Schreiber bequest in the Victoria and Albert Museum. It has the correct enamelled ornithological plumage. Volume 2, Plate 57, The Great Spotted Cuckoo. In another close effort to thank his esteemed patron, Sir Hans Sloane, Edwards includes this, and I quote, great bird within Volume 2. He cites the bird's inclusion in Sir Hans Sloane's own publication, The Natural History of Jamaica. He then tells us that this precise specimen was shot on the Rock of Gibraltar on its passage between southern Europe and northern Africa. The bird was then sent by an English army officer to his brother, the ornithologist Mark Catesby. Catesby then allowed Edwards to borrow it and to examine it, and to, I quote, make what use of it I thought proper, and it was drawn in September 1743. The Chelsea modellers created a model which could easily be used and sold as pairs, as the pair from the Untermeyer bequest at the Metropolitan Museum in New York show. However, this particular bird is also found on a Worcester dessert plate with scallop rim from the rare set of 5 recorded examples of the Worcester Porcelain dessert service decorated by the Giles Atelier, this example being in the H.R. Marshall collection in the Ashmolean at Oxford. Volume 2, Plate 60, The Great Horned Owl. In George Edwards's own words, we are told, this bird is of the greater kind of owls, approaching near in magnitude to the greatest horn or eagle owl. The bigness of the head seems not at all inferior to that of a cat. The wing, when closed, measures from the top to the ends of the quills full 15 inches. Very interestingly, in this particular case, Edwards has the chance to view and observe 3 specimens for his drawings. The first, and I quote, I saw alive in the park of the Right Honourable the Earl of Burlington at his house at Chiswick, and it was brought from Virginia. The second had been dried and preserved, which he, and I quote, received from Hudson's Bay in North America. The third, he states, and I quote, is now kept alive at the Morning Bush Tavern by Aldersgate, London. Thus Edwards further illustrates the network of keen amateur ornithologists all over London, traversing all different classes of the period. This wide-ranging and moneyed clientele formed the social marketplace for the porcelain manufactories to cater for in their sculptural endeavours and models of birds. The Chelsea model of the great horned owl is slightly earlier than those so far discussed, made at the end of the Triangle period and just extending into the raised anchor period, circa 1748 to 50. It is certainly one of the very finest of the bird models derived from the Edwards plate. The mound shown in the original plate now forms the base of this most naturalistic of all models. Models of this bird that are also of derived inspiration to the Edwards plate exist in salt glazed stoneware dating from the end of the 1740s and at Bow in the mid-1750s. Volume 2, Plate 61, The Great Snow Owl. Edward tells us a great deal of interest about this bird as he regards it of great aesthetic beauty. And I quote, this bird comes near the first magnitude of this genus and is the most beautiful of all the species on account of its exceeding snowy whiteness. Its head is less in proportion than in other owls. The wing, when closed, is 16 inches from the shoulder to the top of the longest quill, which may give one judgment of its size. It preys on white partridges and continues in Hudson's Bay all the year. Edwards tells us that he came upon two preserved examples, probably dried and stuffed, the first of which, and I quote, I have deposited in the Museum of the Royal Society, and the deeper spotted one in the collection of Sir Hans Sloane, Baronet. Peter Collinson is mentioned here again as having, and I quote, an oil painting of the size of life, done in Pennsylvania by the order of Mr. Penn, from one of these birds that was taken alive. Now, does he mean the great Quaker William Penn, first of the proprietorial family, or perhaps he means Richard Penn Sr., who was a proprietary and titular governor of the province of Pennsylvania and the counties of Newcastle, Kent, and Sussex, which are now Delaware. He was born in Bristol, and he was the third son of William Penn, founder of Pennsylvania, by his second wife, Hannah Margaret Callowhill. It seems far more likely that this is the Penn Edwards refers to, even though he neglects to put in a Christian name. Edward uses drawings from Hans Sloane's own collection and dried specimens to make this engraved plate. The dried specimens are sent to him by Alexander Light from Hudson's Bay, who Edwards tells us obliged me with many such favours. The rendition of this bird in porcelain comes not from a porcelain model, but on a large Chelsea mug of the Red Anchor period. We are seeing now how such rare and important recordings of these extraordinary birds are fully translated into porcelain models or enamelled onto porcelain with direct provenance back to original scientific specimens, either at the Royal Society or Hans Sloane's collection, which was about to be transferred to become the nucleus of the British Museum's collection. Volume 2, Plate 62, The Little Hawk Owl. This species of owl was drawn originally by Edwards in December 1745. He states that, and I quote, this bird is rather bigger than a sparrowhawk, having much of the air of a hawk from the length of its wings and tail, but from the form of the head and feet declare it to be the kin of the owl kind. I am told by my friend Alexander Light that they fly and prey at high noon, which is contrary to the nature of most of the owl kind. Edwards gleaned much information from his contacts across the Atlantic, and it can be noted here that Alexander Light, who sent two specimens dried to Edwards, stated that its native name is copperacock. It preys on white partridges and other birds, and is so bold as to attend near a fowler with his gun, and will sometimes carry off the partridge after it is shot. The Chelsea Porcelain example of this bird is from the Schreiber bequest in the Victoria and Albert Museum, with raised anchor mark picked out in red enamel. The modeller has kept the form of the branches of the tree exactly as Edwards has designed. Volume 2, Plate 63, the whippoorwill or lesser goatsucker. This bird, drawn by Edwards in 1746, was sent to him by Mark Catesby, along with a female of the same species, dried and preserved. Edward gives us a further insight into the recording of natural enlightened information here by quoting from a letter that Mark Catesby received from a gentleman in America concerning the description and folklore of this bird, and I quote, "They come from Virginia about the middle of April, from which time till the end of June they are heard every night, from dusk until the break of day. They make so very loud and so shrill a noise every night. They are seldom seen in daylight, and the Indians imagine these birds are the souls of their American ancestors." The name whippoorwill, Edwards tells us, comes from, and I quote, its cry, which nearly resembles those words. There are 5 Chelsea examples known of the raised anchor period. The example illustrated here is from the Katz collection at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, though a coloured example with naturalistic enamels faithful to Edwards' engravings has appeared at auction in the past. Volume 2, Plate 66, the black and white Chinese cock pheasant and its hen. Edwards notes that these birds drawn by him from the life in 1745 where they lived, and I quote, "These curious birds were kept for many years by Sir Hans Sloane at his house in London, where they hatched young ones and brought them to maturity. Edwards then states that Elias Albin described the bird in his History of Birds in Volume 3, but that his description must be corrected on account of a mistake in illustrating the tail is too short and an incorrect rendering of the eye. Edwards delicately further states that he himself had had the opportunity to see the birds being the property of my good patron, whose house I frequented, and had the opportunity to repair my drafts by strictly examining them in their minute parts, not only while they were living, but after they were dead. The cockbird, originally belonging to Sir Hans Sloane, was replicated very faithfully by the Chelsea modellers. The rare surviving examples have raised anchor marks picked out in red. This example, formerly in the Hutton and Payne collections, was gifted to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Volume 2, Plate 67, the peacock pheasant from China. An extremely exotic bird observed and drawn from the life by Edwards in 1745. Edwards states that this bird, and I quote, is larger than the common pheasant, and in walking its tail doth not bend into an arch, as it doth in a pheasant's. It is one of the greatest beauties in nature. One may compare its colours to sable, thick set with shining jewels of various colours. We are given a description by Edwards of where he saw the bird. He divulges an interesting insight into lofty ranks of the interest of those who were interested in keeping birds at that time, and his own interest in the movement of birds and creatures from collection to collection, much like the changes of provenance in porcelain now. And I quote, "This bird, when I drew it, was the property of James Monroe, MD of London, a most obliging gentleman, of whom I have received many favours. It has since been presented to Lord Orford, Robert Walpole, the second Earl of Orford, Auditor of the Exchequer, and is now living at his house in the Exchequer." Edwards also gives us a fascinating insight here to his movements and interests within horticulture, for he states that, and I quote, "The flower here figured by way of decoration is called the Chinese rose. I drew it from nature. This beautiful flowering tree was raised by the late curious and noble Lord Peter in his stoves at Thorndon Hill in Essex." A Chelsea model of the raised anchor period is in the Katz collection, Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, was faithfully enamelled in the Dewsbury workshop with the correct ornithological plumage, as you can see here. Volume 2, Plate 68, the painted pheasant from China, drawn in 1745 and observed over a period of time from a bird ultimately owned by Sir Hans Sloane at Cheney Manor, though Edwards had the chance of viewing a dead example given to him by the wife of Sir John Heathcote, Baronet. And Edwards tells us, "This bird is rather smaller than our English pheasant, pretty much shaped like it, but the tail, I think, is longer in proportion, the middle feather being 23 inches long." Edwards goes on to tell us, "These birds of late are frequently brought from China, and I have seen several of them in the possession of our nobility. These birds are pretty hardy and bear our climate well. Sir Hans Sloane has the cock now living, and I think, if I remember rightly, he's had it above 15 years. The model appears here in William Cookworthy's hard-paced Plymouth porcelain dating from 1768 through to 1770. The example here is from the Plymouth City Museum. It's fully coloured, but is also known in the white. And I've recently seen in a private collection the bird painted on a Worcester tea-bowl here, decorated in the London atelier of James Giles." Volume 2, Plate 70, the red-legged partridge from Barbary. Edwards takes care with this bird to assure the reader of all measurements of its wings and stature, and he states that, "I take this bird to be something less than our common partridge, and from wingtip to wingtip extends 19 inches. There may be some mistake here, as our own English or ash-coloured variety is certainly less than this size now in the 21st century. Edwards states that a pair of these birds was sent to me alive by my good friend Mr. Thomas Rawlins, merchant, residing at Santa Cruz, in that part of Barbary which lies without the Straits of Gibraltar on the Atlantic Ocean. A curious and extremely rare Chelsea porcelain tureen and cover of the Red Anchor period, the only recorded example of its type, recently appeared at auction. Although catalogued as a pigeon, it is clear on an examination of the enamelling of the plumage across the whole bird that comprises the tureen and comparing it to Edwards' plate that this is the Barbary red-legged partridge, based on real birds sent to Edwards from Thomas Rawlins from Santa Cruz. Volume 2, Plate 72, The White Partridge. Edwards provides a vivid description of this striking bird and tells us that, and I quote, "This bird is of a middle size between our common partridge and a pheasant, and shaped much like a partridge, except that its tail is a little longer." This precise bird was drawn by Edwards in 1746 and is observed directly from a dried and stuffed skin belonging to Sir Hans Sloane, and I quote, "The stuffed skin of this bird is preserved at Sir Hans Sloane's, from which I made, by draught and description." Edwards notes later on that he received another one shot in winter time by Mr. Alexander Light, and that the feathers were, being in winter, of a perfect snowy whiteness. The model, which we would now classify as a grouse, appears in Chelsea with raised anchor marks picked out in red enamel. A pair is in the Schreiber bequest of the Victoria and Albert Museum, but these come from the Judge Owen Untermeyer bequest, the Metropolitan Museum in New York. These are the examples from the Schreiber collection, the Victoria and Albert Museum. Volume 2, Plate 79, The Green Indian Flycatcher. This rare bird was drawn by Edwards in September 1743, and I quote, "This figure represents the bird of its natural bigness. It is a slender-billed bird, and of that tribe that generally feeds on insects." His friend, fellow birdman and portraitist, who immortalized him on canvas and by engraving, Joseph Dandridge, supplied this bird to him, and I quote, "Mr. Dandridge obliged me with this bird. It was sent to him with others from Bengal." There is one exceedingly rare example in Chelsea porcelain from the Untermeyer bequest in the Metropolitan Museum in New York that is based on this Edwards plate. No others are currently recorded. Volume 2, Plate 81, The Little Black, White and Red Indian Creeper. This rare bird is rendered of its exact size according to Edwards, which is only about 2 inches from beak to tail. He states, and I quote, "I have given it the name of creeper from the agreement in the shape of the bill with our creeper, it being bowed down and sharp pointed." Again, with this tiny bird, it is his friend and artist and Aurelian Society founder and member, Joseph Dandridge, who supplied the bird to him, and I quote, "My friend, Mr. Dandridge in Moorfields, obliged me with a sight of this elegant bird, which was sent to him from Bengal in the East Indies. It was neatly stuffed and very well preserved and fresh in all its colours." The Chelsea porcelain example is part of the Schreiber bequest of the Victoria and Albert Museum. It is thus far the only example recorded of this bird belonging originally to Joseph Dandridge of Moorfields. However, I've recently seen a Worcester teacup decorated in the London atelier of James Giles, which shows this bird. It is coloured, however, as to the description Edwards clearly defines in his text, that the black plumage, and I quote, "the black parts being very glossy and reflecting a dark blue," which has been exactly adhered to by the enameller in the Giles atelier here, making me surmise that these naturalistic services, of which we have now only rare surviving remnants, were made as special commissions for London birdmen or bird collectors of stature and with funds. Volume 2, Plate 83, the black and yellow mannequin. Edwards states that the lower figure in this plate, and I quote, "represents this bird of its natural bigness. It is of the genus of the golden-headed black titmouse. Edwards states that he has seen a further 4 drawings, of which the feathers slightly differ in colour and are more orange than the example which he saw that was preserved and owned as a specimen by a Mr. Blue. He states that it is a species that comes from South America. He thinks that the bird with the deeper red plumage must be the cockbird. I have recently seen this precise bird from the description that Edwards gives of the drawing shown to him that has the deeper red plumage on the Worcester cup, on the Worcester coffee cup enamelled in the London atelier of James Giles, and here it is from a private English collection. Volume 2, plate 84, the Indian green finch. Edwards observes this bird in 1745, and he tells us this bird is here figured in its full natural bigness. It appears a little like a canary bird, but I think it is something larger. First of all, he also states that he was shown a sketch of this bird by a Mr. John Hawkins, who had sketched the bird on Madeira. Hawkins told him that it had come from the Bengals and that it sings far finer than a canary bird. Edwards did not like to use the drawing as he had not observed it himself, though his chance came to do so shortly afterwards, and I quote, "But since I have seen 2 of these birds and heard them sing at the house of Mr. Blunt, merchants in Goodman's Fields, I was informed at Mr. Blunt's that these birds were brought from the East Indies." Dr. Henry Plumtree, president of the Royal College of Physicians, saw these birds at Mr. Blunt's and was so good to gain me admittance to make my observations on them. As librarian of the Royal College of Physicians, Edwards was well placed to gain contacts in this way. We are beginning to see records of what comes near to conversations through these memoir-like descriptions and connections that are constantly revealed by Edwards as to the circles of passionate birdmen, traders and collectors of the period. Edwards even records the butterfly illustrated on the plate here as brought from China by my friend Captain Isaac Worth, who presented me with a box of insects from that country. Clearly, Edwards was linked to fellow Aurelians like Dandridge, James Pettifer, and Isaac Worth in a close way as the birdmen in London. This bird, which once belonged to Mr. Blunt, which we can see is depicted by Edwards in singing attitude, and the Chelsea example with raised anchor mark picked out in red enamel, is from the Schreiber bequest at the Victoria and Albert Museum. Volume 2, plate 86, the red-breasted, long-tailed finch. This very exotic cockbird was observed and drawn by Edwards from the life. It is a bird of lively action and a pretty note, and by various motions in raising and lowering its long tail, it makes a very diverting appearance. Edwards states that this bird was the property of the obliging Mr. Hatton, of Lawrence Lane, London, who kept it alive for many years. Edwards was able to view this bird on many occasions so as to record the various moltings which occurred throughout the year, which to begin with clearly caused worry and consternation. The bird was brought from Angola, Africa. Edwards was told that the Portuguese call this bird the widow from its colour and long train. This splendid bird, which once belonged to Mr. Hatton of Lawrence Lane, appears in all its glory on one of the full panels of naturalistic birds from the pair of Worcester porcelain hexagonal vases and covers, decorated in the London atelier of James Giles from the Gerald Cook bequest in the Museum of Royal Worcester. Volume 2, plate 99, the dusky and spotted duck. Edwards, who sketched this plate in September 1745, describes this duck as, and I quote, as about the bigness of a common mallard or duck. He tells us too that this particular bird was viewed by him in a preserved state, and that it has been sent with another from Newfoundland in America. And I quote, "It was lent to me by Mr. Holmes of the Tower of London." The duck once belonging to Mr. Holmes of the Tower was modelled at Chelsea with the raised anchor mark and can be seen in the Schreiber bequest of the Victoria and Albert Museum. Rather wonderfully, not only is the plumage directly correct, but also the water reeds have been evoked on the base of the model in the same way as in the original engraving. Volume 2, Plate 100, The Little Black and White Duck. A well-known plate of a rather endearing subject, and Edward states, and I quote, "This bird seems something less than the common duck. I take it to be the size of a widgeon." The duck was given to Edwards by Mr. Holmes, again of the Tower, saying that it had come from Newfoundland, and that the seamen there call it the Spirit. Edwards describes it as a sudden diver, appearing again in a distant part of the sea. The Chelsea porcelain models here, 1749 to 52, have the raised anchor mark picked out in red enamel. And here are the pair in the Untermeyer bequest at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. Volume 2, Plate 102, The Chinese Teal. Edwards states that this surprising uncommon bird is about the size of our teal. Its colours are as beautiful as the form of its wings is rare. He drew this bird at Richmond, Surrey in 1746, and I quote, "From the living bird kept in the gardens of Sir Matthew Decker, Baronet." Rather interestingly, for those who are fascinated by such historical and horticultural nuggets, take a close look at the white flowers at the base of the plate. Edwards tells us that the white flower, which I have decorated the groundwork, is after nature and is found growing in all waters about London in the months of May and June. There is a pair of these extremely rare Chelsea porcelain Chinese teal in an English private collection, having been deaccessioned by the Metropolitan Museum in New York in 2015 at Christie's. Only one other pair appear to be recorded. They bear the applied raised anchor marks picked out in red enamel. Were they once owned by Sir Matthew Decker? This poses the question of whether the enlightened owner of these exotic birds and fowl be eager not only to subscribe to the books, as can be seen in the list of subscribers to Edward's 4 volumes, but also have their own birds commemorated in Chelsea porcelain. An interesting thought for these very rare examples. We now move on to volume 3, published in 1750, and printed for the author George Edwards at the College of Physicians in Warwick Lane. Edwards dedicates this, his 3rd volume, to the President, Council and Fellows of the Royal Society. Volume 3, Plate 109, The Roller. Edwards writes that this bird is of the bigness of a magpie, but longer winged and shorter legged. He tells us that the bird from which he made his observations was shot on the rocks of Gibraltar, and that he observed it to be a cock bird on account of its beauty. The bird was sent to him in London by the naturalist Mark Catesby, probably from his brother who was stationed there, as we know. He tells us that it appears to be found across Africa, Sicily and Malta. The colours of the birds are vividly described by Edwards as of purples and blues, though the example here which directly compares to the plate is of a more multicoloured variety. The Chelsea example shown here with raised anchor mark picked out in red enamel is in the Katz collection, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. We move on now to volume 4, where we find the next bird. Volume 4 and the last, printed for the author at the College of Physicians in Warwick Lane, 1751. Edwards dedicates the last and final volume of his life's work to God, and I quote, "To God, the one eternal, the incomprehensible, the omnipresent, omnificent, and almighty creator of all things that exist. From orbs immeasurably great, the minutest points of matter, this atom is dedicated and devoted with all possible gratitude, humility, worship, and the highest adoration both of mind and body, by his most resigned, low, and humble creature, George Edwards. It is an incredibly touching and moving dedication. Volume 4, plate 170, The First Black-capped Lory. Edwards describes this bird as something bigger than a turtle dove, but not quite so big as a dove-house pigeon. He describes the plumage in an intensely detailed way, which makes the reader realize, even early on in his text, that he has been able to observe this bird from the life and handle it. And he notes that the skin is, and I quote, rough and scaly. This particular bird has been taken in inspiration and copied by the enameller in the London atelier of James Giles, who decorated this wonderful Worcester large punch bowl. Edwards, in his own words, tells us, and I quote, "These birds are brought from the East Indies. I saw the bird from which the figure was taken at the Virginia Coffee House behind the Royal Exchange, and another of them in the collection of my late friend George Holmes, keeper of the records in the Tower of London." The punch bowl is from an English private collection. We come on to our last image now, Volume 4, plate 168, The Little Green Parrot. Edwards states that this parrot, and I quote, is about the size of a small pigeon. He tells us now that he owned the bird, and I quote, it being bought out of a dealer's hands, though the dealer was unable to tell him from where it had come from, though Edwards supposed it might have been the West Indies. And he touchingly tells us that, and I quote, "It was my property. I kept it alive for years. It was brisk, lively, and a nimble bird, and talkative in a language quite unknown to me." Of course, as Edwards was not married, this was perhaps his only companion at home. Edward's parrot, sadly we do not know its name, even if it had one, was gladly commemorated and modelled at the Bow Manufactory. The example in the Victorian Albert Museum here, and it is an extremely engaging example of a touchingly remote link to the great birdman and father of ornithologists. Through this journey, through the 4 volumes of the natural history of uncommon birds, one is simply guided through 18th century London by Edwards himself. It is necessary to read his words, as it is like a personal memoir of his collecting friends and his noble patron Sir Hans Sloane. One sees Edwards as a man equal to ourselves in our joy in gathering new information to record against our own collections. The voice of Edwards and those of his fellow birdmen come to life in these volumes, but the lives of the birds that he records lives with us, through not only the books, but also the porcelain that they are recreated in. Thus it is their story, from egg to depiction, by Edwards, that we celebrate even today, and a social network that can be traced through the lives of the owners and the creatures in the guise of these porcelain birds. Thank you very much.